The wind that came down off the Sawtooth Peaks in the autumn of 1878 had a voice like a woman crying, and it was that very sound, thin and desperate beneath the howl of the storm, that made Gideon Monroe rein in his horse on the narrow pass above Willow Hollow and listen. He had lived in the Colorado high country for the better part of 9 years, long enough to know the difference between wind moaning through a rock chimney and a human being in trouble. He sat still in the saddle, snow already crusting on the shoulders of his buffalo coat, his breath fogging out into the gray afternoon, and he listened again. There it was. A cry, cracked and small, coming from somewhere below the switchback where the old freight road cut along the ridge before dropping toward the valley. He turned his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Samson, off the trail and down through the drifts, pushing aside low pine boughs heavy with new snow. The storm had come early that year, rolling down from the Wind River country 3 days before it had any right to, catching ranchers with cattle still on summer range, and travelers still on the road who had believed they had another 2 weeks before the passes closed. Gideon had spent the morning checking his trap lines, and had been ready to hole up in his cabin for what looked to be a several-day blow, but something had told him to ride the ridge one more time before nightfall, and he had learned long ago not to argue with the things his gut told him in these mountains. He found her in a shallow gully, where the freight road had washed out the spring before, a place where a wagon might easily lose a wheel or a horse might stumble and not right itself again. The wagon was there, canted hard to one side, one wheel shattered against a boulder, the horse gone, whether bolted or stolen by wolves he could not yet say. And beneath the wagon's bed, huddled against the broken boards for whatever shelter they gave, was a woman wrapped in a quilt that was clearly not finished. He could see the batting exposed along one edge where the backing had not yet been stitched, the pattern of stars and diamonds only half assembled, loose threads trailing like the legs of some pale insect. She had pulled it around her shoulders and over her knees, but it was not enough, not nearly enough, against a mountain storm, and her lips had gone the color of a bruise and her whole body shook, with a violence that told him she did not have much longer. "Ma'am," he called out, swinging down from Samson before the horse had even come to a full stop. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her eyes opened, slow and unfocused, dark eyes in a face gone white as the snow around her. She was young, he saw, younger than he had first guessed from the shape of her beneath the quilt, perhaps 24 years, with hair the color of chestnut escaping from beneath a wool bonnet that had slipped half off her head. Her lips moved, but no sound came out, only a thread of white breath. "I've got you," Gideon said, kneeling in the snow beside her, his big hands already working at the buckles of his own coat. "I've got you now. You just hold on." He did not waste time on questions. There would be time enough for questions later, if there was to be a later at all, and he intended to see to it that there was. He shrugged out of his buffalo coat and wrapped it around her over the thin, unfinished quilt. But even as he did it, he knew it would not be enough. Not with her already so far gone into the cold, her body having stopped its shivering, which was worse than the shivering had been, for a body that stopped shaking in weather like this was a body giving up the fight. He had, tied behind his saddle, a quilt of his own, one that had been finished a year before by his late mother's own hands and sent to him from Missouri before she passed, a heavy double-sided quilt of wool and cotton batting, tightly stitched, bound all the way around, made to keep a man alive on nights when the fire went low. He tore it free of the leather ties with hands that did not feel the cold any more themselves, and he wrapped it around her, over the coat, over the broken threads of her own half-made work, and he gathered her up against his chest, this stranger, this woman he did not yet know the name of, and he held her there in the howling white afternoon and said her name would not matter yet, only that she keep breathing. "Stay with me," he said low into her hair. "Stay with me now." Her eyes fluttered, and for one terrible moment he thought he had lost her, that the mountain had already taken what it wanted before he could stop it. Then her fingers, stiff and blue at the tips, closed weakly around a fold of the finished quilt, as though some part of her recognized the difference between what was whole and what was not, and understood which one she meant to hold on to. "That's it," Gideon murmured. "That's it. You hold on to that." He lifted her then, quilt and all, and carried her to Samson, and mounted with her cradled against him, one arm locked around her body and the reins gathered in the other hand. And he turned the horse toward home, toward the cabin 2 miles down along Willow Creek, where a fire still burned in the hearth, and where, God willing, this woman whose name he did not know would live to see the morning. The cabin that Gideon Monroe had built with his own hands stood in a stand of lodgepole pine above the creek, 2 rooms and a loft. With a stone chimney he had laid himself over the course of one long summer, stone by stone, and a porch roof that kept the snow from piling against the door. He had chosen the site for the way the mountains shouldered up behind it to break the worst of the winter wind, and for the spring that ran close by and never froze even in the hardest months. And in 9 years he had never once regretted the choice, not even in the loneliest stretches of February when the snow came up past the windows, and there was no one to talk to but the horse and the dog. He carried Alma Reed, though he did not yet know that was her name, through the cabin door and laid her before the hearth where the coals still glowed red beneath the ash, and he built the fire up fast and high, feeding it dry pine and then heavier logs until the flames roared and threw heat clear across the room. He stripped the quilts from her only enough to see that her clothes beneath were soaked through with melted snow, and he understood, as any man who had spent winters in that country understood, that wet clothing against skin in cold like this was a kind of slow murder, and he would have to get her out of it whether modesty allowed for it or not. "Forgive me," he said to her unconscious form, though she could not hear him, and he worked the buttons of her traveling dress with fingers that trembled now, not from cold but from something closer to fear, fear that he would be too slow, that he had already brought her too far into the cold before finding her. He got her out of the wet wool and into one of his own flannel shirts, and then he wrapped her again in the finished quilt, and then in a second one from his own bed, and he built a nest of blankets before the fire and laid her within it, and only then did he sit back on his heels and let himself breathe. Her breathing, when he pressed his ear close to check it, was shallow but steady. Her color, though still pale, had lost the blue tinge from her lips. He allowed himself to hope. He spent that first night awake beside her, feeding the fire, warming broth on the hearth stones that he tried, spoonful by careful spoonful, to get past her lips even while she slept, because a body needed warmth from the inside as much as from without. Outside the storm did not let up. The wind screamed against the cabin walls and drove snow into every crack and seam, and twice during the night Gideon rose to check that the door had not frozen shut, that the chimney still drew smoke properly, that the horse and the milk cow in the lean-to shed were still sheltered and breathing. Near dawn, when the gray light had begun to press weakly through the one small window, the woman's eyes opened, and this time they found him and stayed on him, and though they were still clouded with exhaustion and fever, there was a mind behind them now, a person looking out. "Where?" she began, and her voice cracked, dry as old rope, and she tried again. "Where am I?" "You're safe," Gideon said, and he kept his voice low and even the way he might speak to a spooked horse. "You're in my cabin on Willow Creek up above the old freight road. I found you under your wagon yesterday evening. You were near froze through." She stared at him for a long moment, taking in his face, weathered brown from years of sun and wind, his beard, close-trimmed but full dark hair threaded here and there with premature gray, though he could not have been much past 30, and his shoulders, which even sitting still seemed to fill up half the room, broad and thick with muscle built from years of felling timber and hauling traps and wrestling stubborn horses through mountain passes. Whatever she saw in his face seemed to ease something in her, for her own shoulders loosened beneath the quilts. "My wagon," she said. "My horse. Is my horse. I didn't find any horse," Gideon admitted. Wagon's still up there, wheel busted clean off. I'll ride up and see what I can salvage once this storm breaks, but I won't lie to you, ma'am. A horse loose in that country in a storm like this one, the odds aren't good." Her face crumpled, not into tears exactly, but into a kind of weary grief that told him the horse had mattered to her, perhaps mattered a great deal, and he found himself wanting badly to have better news to give her. "I'm sorry," he said. "I truly am." "He was called Duke," she said softly. "My father's horse before he passed. I don't suppose it matters much to you." "It matters," Gideon said, and he meant it. "Everything a person loses matters. I don't hold with pretending otherwise." She studied him again, and something like the beginning of trust flickered across her exhausted features. "You saved my life," she said. "I remember that much. I remember you putting something over me, something warm." "My mother's quilt," Gideon said. "She made it for me before she passed, sent it out from Missouri 2 winters back. Never had cause to be gladder of a gift in my life than I was yesterday." The woman's gaze drifted toward the corner of the room, where Gideon had laid her own quilt, the unfinished one, across the back of a chair to dry, its stars and diamonds still incomplete, threads still hanging loose. Her eyes filled, and this time the tears did come, sliding down over cheeks gone hollow with exhaustion and cold. "That was to be a wedding quilt," she said. "I was bringing it to my sister. She's to be married in Silverton come spring, and I promised her I'd finish the pattern and bring it myself, and now look at it, ruined, same as everything else on that wagon." "It ain't ruined," Gideon said. "Wet quilting dries, thread can be resewn. You're the one thing on that wagon that near didn't survive, and you did. That's what matters." She looked at him then with an expression he could not quite name, something between disbelief and gratitude and the first stirring of something warmer, and she said, in a voice still hoarse but steadier now, "I don't even know your name." "Gideon Monroe," he said. "I trap and I run a few horses and I keep mostly to myself up here, but I've got a fire and enough broth to see you strong again, and that's about the whole of what I've got to offer." "Alma Reed," she said. "I was traveling from Denver to Silverton, and I expect I'd be dead in a snowbank if you hadn't come along when you did, Mr. Monroe. So I'd say what you've got to offer is a good deal more than you're letting on." Gideon felt something shift in his chest at the sound of his own name spoken in her voice, something he did not have a word for yet, though he suspected, even in that first hour, that he would come to know it well before the winter was through. The storm held the mountains in its grip for 4 days straight, snow piling in drifts higher than a man's waist against the north side of the cabin, and in those 4 days Alma Reed slept a great deal, waking only to take broth and weak tea, and to speak with Gideon in halting exchanges that grew longer and easier each time. She told him in pieces of her life in Denver, where she had kept house for her widowed father until his death the previous spring, and of her skill with a needle, a skill her mother had taught her before dying when Alma was but 12 years old, leaving her to raise herself largely on instruction manuals and the kindness of neighbor women. She told him of her sister Louisa, 5 years her junior, who had gone ahead to Silverton to marry a mine assier named Thomas Whitfield, and of the promise Alma had made to bring the wedding quilt herself rather than trust it to freight, because some things, she said, a person had to carry with their own hands. Gideon, in turn, told her of his own history sparingly at first, and then, as the days wore on and something in her steady, unjudging attention loosened his tongue more freely. He had come west from Kentucky as a young man of 19, following an older brother who had since died of fever in a mining camp near Fairplay, and he had spent the years since trapping and running horses and building the cabin they now sat in, alone, mostly by choice, though he admitted on the 3rd night, with the fire burning low and Alma's eyes steady on his face, that the choice had grown heavier on him of late than it once had. "A man gets used to quiet," he said. "But used to ain't the same as content with. I expect I forgot the difference for a spell. And now," Alma asked, her voice careful, "now I've had 4 days of company," Gideon said, "and I find I don't much care for the notion of going back to quiet." Alma did not answer that directly, but she smiled, the first full smile he had seen from her, and it did something to her whole face, brightened it the way sun breaking through cloud brightens a valley, and Gideon found himself smiling back before he had decided to. By the fifth day the storm had blown itself out, leaving behind a world scoured white and silent, the sky a hard, clean blue, the sun glaring off the snow with a brightness that hurt the eyes. Alma was strong enough by then to sit up unaided and even to walk a little about the cabin, though Gideon fussed over her more than she strictly wanted, insisting she stay near the fire and wrapped warm, an insistence she did not fight too hard against, for she had come to enjoy, more than she would have admitted aloud, the particular attention of this quiet, strong-handed man. On that fifth morning, Gideon saddled Samson and rode up to the site of the wrecked wagon to see what could be salvaged. He found the wagon much as he had left it, half buried now in drifted snow, and no sign at all of the horse Duke, not even tracks, the storm having erased whatever fate had befallen the animal. He dug through the wagon bed and found Alma's trunk, soaked but intact, containing a modest wardrobe, a Bible that had belonged to her mother, a sewing basket with needles and thread and a good pair of shears, and beneath it all, wrapped in oilcloth against the weather, bolts of fabric she had been carrying to finish the quilt on the road, blues and creams, and a deep rust red that she had told him was meant for the border. He loaded what he could onto Samson and rode back down to the cabin, and when he laid the trunk before Alma and watched her face as she opened it and found her mother's Bible dry and whole inside its oilcloth wrapping, he felt a satisfaction more complete than any he could remember feeling in a long while. "You went back for this," Alma said, holding the Bible against her chest, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You didn't have to do that." "Seemed like the kind of thing a person shouldn't have to lose twice," Gideon said, and he did not know quite what to do with the way she looked at him then, so he busied himself with the fire and let the moment pass, though it did not truly pass, not for either of them, but settled instead into some quiet corner of the cabin where it would wait to be taken up again. The days that followed took on a rhythm neither of them had quite expected, but both, in their separate silences, found themselves grateful for. Alma's strength returned steadily, color coming back into her cheeks, and with her strength returned her restlessness, the restlessness of a woman accustomed to useful work who did not know what to do with idle hands. She asked Gideon on the seventh day if he might fetch her sewing basket and the fabric bolts from the trunk, for she meant to finish the quilt after all, storm or no storm, and Gideon, who had begun to understand that arguing with Alma Reed once she had set her mind to something was a losing proposition, brought her what she asked for, and then sat across the small cabin table from her, mending a broken trap line, while she worked the needle through the star pattern with a skill that made the motion look effortless, though he suspected it was anything but. "You've got fine hands for that work," Gideon observed, watching the way her fingers moved quick and sure, drawing the thread through in even, tiny stitches. "My mother used to say a woman's whole life could be read in her quilts," Alma said without looking up. "Every scrap of fabric telling where it came from. This blue here," she touched a small triangle of pale blue calico, "was from a dress I wore the summer my mother died. And this," she touched a fragment of soft yellow, "was from my father's good shirt, the one he wore the day he walked me to the church for my confirmation. And this one?" Gideon asked, pointing to a piece of rough brown wool that seemed out of place among the finer cottons. Alma's hand stilled for a moment. "That one I don't have a story for yet," she said. "I only just added it from the coat I was wearing the day my wagon went over. I expect I'll think of what it means, given time." Gideon looked at the small square of brown wool set among the stars and diamonds, and something in him understood, without either of them saying it plainly, that the story of that particular scrap of fabric was still being written, that it belonged to these very days, this cabin, this fire, and perhaps to him as well, though he did not say so, only returned to his mending with a small, private smile he did not think Alma noticed, though in fact she had noticed it entirely, and had smiled down at her own work to hide her pleasure in it. It was during the second week of her recovery, when the immediate danger had passed, and the two of them had settled into an easy companionship that neither wished to examine too closely, that the practical question of what was to become of Alma Reed rose up between them and could no longer be avoided. "I need to get word to my sister," Alma said one evening, as they sat before the fire, she with her quilting, Gideon oiling a set of traps. "Louisa will be frantic. I was to arrive in Silverton near a fortnight ago. Nearest town with a telegraph office is Hartwell," Gideon said. "Half a day's ride in good weather, though the pass between here and there is still choked with snow. I could go myself once the drifts settle some, send word for you." "I could go with you," Alma said. Gideon set down the trap he had been oiling and looked at her steadily. "You're stronger than you were, that's true enough, but you're not strong enough yet for a half-day's ride through snow that'll come up to a horse's belly in places. Give it another week. Let your body finish what it started healing." Alma frowned, not at him exactly, but at the truth of what he said, which she could not entirely dispute. "A week," she said, "and what happens to my sister's peace of mind in that week, wondering if I froze to death on some mountain road?" "I'll go tomorrow," Gideon said. "Alone. Send word from Hartwell that you're safe and recovering and will follow when you're able. That eases her mind without risking yours." Alma considered this, her needle stilled in the fabric, and finally nodded. "Thank you," she said, "for thinking of it, for thinking of her when she's a stranger to you." "She's your sister," Gideon said simply, as though that settled the matter entirely, and to him it did. He rode to Hartwell the next morning, a town of perhaps 400 souls nestled where two mountain valleys met, with a general store, a telegraph office run out of the back of the land agent's building, a church with a leaning steeple, and two saloons that did a brisk trade with the miners who worked the silver claims up the gulch. He sent the telegram to Silverton as promised, a brief message assuring Louisa Whitfield that her sister Alma had survived a wagon accident and storm, and was recovering under the care of a local trapper, and would travel on to Silverton as soon as she was able. While in town, he also stopped at the general store, run by a stout, sharp-eyed woman named Bertha Coyle, who knew everyone's business within a 50-mile radius and was not shy about sharing it. Bertha eyed Gideon with open curiosity as he purchased flour, coffee, and a length of good wool broadcloth. "Wool broadcloth, Gideon Monroe," Bertha said, ringing up his purchases. "In 9 years I don't believe I've ever known you to buy anything but what a man needs for his own back and his own traps." "What's this for then?" "A friend," Gideon said, not meeting her eye. "A friend," Bertha repeated, with the particular emphasis of a woman who has heard every excuse a man might offer and finds them all equally transparent. Would this friend happen to be the young woman half the county's herd was found half froze under her own wagon and carried off by a mountain man? Gideon's jaw tightened. "News travels fast in these parts." "News travels fast everywhere, Gideon, that's the nature of news," Bertha said, not unkindly. "Is she well?" "She's healing," Gideon said. "Strong woman, stronger than the storm gave her credit for." "And when she's healed," Bertha said, folding the broadcloth with brisk efficiency, "what then?" "She'll go on to Silverton, I expect, to that sister of hers." Gideon had not let himself think too far past the present moment, past the daily rhythm of fires built and broth warmed and quilting watched by lamplight, and Bertha's question landed in his chest with an unexpected weight. "I expect she will," he said. "That was her intention from the start." "Was it?" Bertha said, and there was something knowing in her tone that Gideon chose not to examine, and he paid for his goods and left the store with more on his mind than he had carried into it. He returned to the cabin by late afternoon to find Alma standing at the window, watching for him, and the sight of her there, waiting, sent a warmth through him that had nothing to do with the fire behind her. "Louisa knows you're safe," he told her, setting down his purchases. "I sent word from Hartwell." Relief broke openly across Alma's face. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you, Gideon." It was the first time she had used his given name without the courtesy title before it, and both of them seemed to notice the shift at the same moment. A small thing, and yet not small at all, and Gideon found he liked the sound of his name in her mouth a great deal more than he had any right to. The weeks that followed settled into something neither of them named aloud but both understood, in the quiet way people understand things they are not yet ready to speak. Alma's strength returned fully, and with it, a restless energy that found its outlet in useful work about the cabin. She mended Gideon's shirts, worn thin at the elbows from years of hard use, and she cooked meals that made use of the venison and trout Gideon brought in, seasoning them with skill that spoke of a woman who had run a household from a young age. Gideon, in turn, found himself doing small things he had not troubled himself with in years, clearing the path to the spring more carefully so she would not slip, hanging a curtain over the one small window because she mentioned once that she liked the softness of light through fabric, riding an extra hour to Hartwell simply to fetch a particular kind of needle Bertha Coyle had mentioned getting in. In the evenings they talked, long unhurried conversations that ranged from the practical to the personal, and Gideon learned that Alma's quiet exterior hid a sharp wit and a stubborn independence that had kept her unmarried at 24 despite what she admitted, with a rueful laugh, had been no shortage of suitors in Denver. None of them wanted a wife who'd rather quilt than dance, Alma said one evening. Or one who'd argue a point of scripture with the reverend and not back down simply because he wore the collar. Sounds to me like they wanted a different sort of woman altogether, Gideon said. One that wasn't you. That's precisely what I concluded, Alma said. Though it made for a lonely few years concluding it. Lonely ain't the worst thing a person can be, Gideon said. I spent 9 years up here mostly alone and called it peace. But I'll admit, and here he paused, choosing his words with the same care he might use setting a trap, I've come to think peace and loneliness aren't always the same thing wearing different names, and maybe I confused the two longer than I ought to have. Alma's needle stilled again, as it often did when Gideon said something that reached past the surface of easy conversation into something truer. And what have you concluded since? She asked, not looking up from her quilting, though her voice had gone soft and careful. That the quiet's been different since you came, Gideon said. Fuller, somehow, even when neither of us is talking. I don't rightly know how to explain it better than that. Alma looked up then, and the firelight caught the color rising in her cheeks, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the air between them charged with something that had been building slow and steady since the day he had carried her in from the snow, and might have found its voice then, in that quiet cabin, had not the cow in the lean-to shed chosen that exact moment to bawl loudly enough to startle them both into laughter, breaking the tension, though not erasing it, only setting it aside for another evening. That evening came sooner than either expected, on a night some 3 weeks after the storm, when the snow had settled enough that Gideon judged Alma strong enough and the roads clear enough to make the journey on to Silverton should she still wish to go. He raised the matter over supper, watching her face carefully as he did. The pass should be clear enough by week's end, he said. I could take you on to Silverton myself, see you safe to your sister's door. Alma was quiet for a long moment, her fork still against her plate. I suppose that's the sensible thing, she said finally. Louisa will be waiting. She will, Gideon agreed, and neither of them said what both were thinking, which was that the prospect of the journey's end, of Alma settling into her sister's household in Silverton, and Gideon returning alone to his quiet cabin, sat like a stone in both their chests. Gideon, Alma said, and there was a new note in her voice, careful and brave at once. May I ask you something and trust you to answer honestly? You may. If I go on to Silverton, she said, will I ever see you again? Gideon set down his own fork and looked at her across the small table, and he found in that moment that the careful reserve he had maintained for 9 years alone in these mountains had worn thin as old cloth, and he could not, in honesty, keep pretending it still held. I don't want you to go on to Silverton and me never see you again, he said. Truth is, Alma, I don't much want you to go on to Silverton at all, though I know that's a selfish thing for me to say when your sister's waiting and you've a whole life plan that doesn't include some trapper's cabin in the high country. What if, Alma said slowly, I told you I wasn't certain anymore what my life plan included? Then I'd say, Gideon said, his voice rough with feeling he had not let himself voice before, that I've come to care for you more than I know how to say plain, Alma Reed. Came to care for you somewhere between that first night watching you breathe by the fire, terrified you'd stop, and this evening watching you eat supper like it's the most natural thing in the world, you sitting at my table. And I don't know what a woman like you wants with a man like me, rough as I am, but I know I don't want you riding out of my life without at least saying so. Alma's eyes had filled with tears, but she was smiling too, an expression Gideon had come to treasure more than he had known was possible. A man like you, she said, is a man who rode out into a blizzard and found me when any sensible person would have stayed by their fire. A man who went back for my mother's Bible when he didn't have to. A man who's shown me more tenderness in 3 weeks than I've known in 24 years. I don't want a different sort of man, Gideon Monroe. I want this one if he'll have me. Gideon rose from the table and Alma rose too, and he crossed the small distance of the cabin floor to her, and he took her face in his big, calloused hands with a gentleness that belied their strength, and he kissed her there in the firelight, slow and certain. And when he drew back she was crying and laughing both at once, and he wiped her tears away with his thumb and said, I reckon that settles what my intentions are, if there was any doubt left. There wasn't much, Alma said, laughing, but I'm glad to have it settled all the same. They did not rush the matter, for both of them understood that a decision made in the warmth of new feeling deserved time to prove itself steady, and so it was agreed that Gideon would still escort Alma to Silverton as planned, that she would spend some weeks with her sister Louisa, and attend the wedding she had traveled so far to see, and that if her feelings held true across that separation, as his own he was certain would, they would speak again of a future together upon her return. The journey to Silverton took the better part of 2 days, a long road still snow-packed but passable, Gideon driving a wagon he had borrowed from a neighboring rancher, Alma beside him wrapped warm in the finished quilt that had saved her life, the unfinished wedding quilt carefully packed in her trunk behind them, nearly complete now, needing only its final border to be whole. Silverton, when they reached it, proved a bustling mining town tucked into a high valley ringed by peaks that seemed to Alma even grander than those around Gideon's cabin, the streets busy with miners and merchants, the air smelling of coal smoke and pine. Louisa Whitfield, a slighter, fairer echo of her older sister, wept openly when Alma stepped down from the wagon, embracing her so fiercely that Alma nearly lost her footing, and the two sisters stood clinging to each other in the muddy street while Gideon looked on, feeling, not for the first time, the particular ache of a man witnessing a love he understood but had rarely been permitted to feel directed at himself. I thought you were dead, Louisa said, pulling back to study her sister's face as though checking for injuries. I thought I'd lost you same as we lost mother and father, and I'd never forgive myself for letting you make that journey alone. I wasn't alone in the end, Alma said, and she turned to look at Gideon still seated in the wagon, and something in her expression made Louisa's sharp eyes narrow with sudden curious interest. And who is this? Louisa asked, looking between her sister and the broad-shouldered mountain man who had gone somewhat pink about the ears under her scrutiny. This is Gideon Monroe, Alma said. He's the one who found me, who saved my life. Is that so? Louisa said, with a slow smile beginning to spread across her face, a smile that suggested she understood a great deal more than had been stated outright. Well, Mr. Monroe, I expect a man who saves my sister's life is owed at least a proper supper and a warm bed before he rides back into those mountains. Won't you come in? Gideon stayed 3 days in Silverton, guest in the home of Thomas Whitfield and his bride-to-be Louisa, And in those 3 days he watched Alma among her family, saw the easy affection between the sisters, the gentle teasing, the shared memories of a mother and father both gone too soon, and he came to understand more fully the woman he had fallen for, the shape of the life she had lived before the mountains claimed her, however briefly, as her own. Louisa, for her part, took Gideon aside on the second evening, while Alma helped Thomas's mother with wedding preparations in the next room, and studied him with the same frank assessment she seemed to apply to everything. "My sister has never once looked at a man the way she looks at you," Louisa said without preamble. "Not in 24 years, not through a dozen suitors our father paraded before her hoping to see her settled. I don't pretend to know what happened up in those mountains, Mr. Monroe, but I know my sister, and I know that look, and I'll ask you plainly, what are your intentions?" Gideon met her gaze steadily, unoffended by the directness of the question, for he respected a person who spoke their mind plainly, having little patience himself for those who danced around a subject. "My intentions, Miss Reed, are to marry your sister if she'll have me, and to spend whatever years I've got left making certain she never regrets the choice." Louisa's stern expression cracked into a wide, delighted smile. "Well then," she said, "I expect you'd best ask her properly, and soon, because I don't intend to let my sister live her whole life 2 days' ride from the nearest family without at least the comfort of knowing she's happy where she's landed." "I mean to," Gideon said, "though I thought it right to let some time pass first, let her feelings settle and prove themselves against distance before I press the matter." "That's more patience than I'd have credited a mountain man with," Louisa said, "but I suppose there's more to you than the buckskin and the beard, Mr. Monroe." "I should hope so," Gideon said, and Louisa laughed, and from that evening on regarded him with the easy warmth of a woman who has decided, on her own good judgment, that a person deserves her trust. The wedding of Louisa Reed and Thomas Whitfield took place a week later in the small Silverton church, and Alma's quilt, finished at last in the days before the ceremony, with Alma sewing late into each night by lamplight, her stitches steady and sure even as her eyes grew heavy, was presented to the couple as a wedding gift, spread across the altar rail for all the congregation to admire, its stars and diamonds glowing warm in the candlelight. The small square of rough brown wool set among the finer fabrics like a promise, not yet fully spoken. Gideon stood at the back of the church during the ceremony, having stayed on in Silverton at Louisa's insistence, and watched Alma across the crowded room, radiant in a blue dress that had survived the wreck of her wagon, her face soft with happiness for her sister. And he thought, not for the first time, that he had never in his life seen anything so fine as Alma Reed standing in candlelight, and he resolved that he would not let too many more weeks pass before he made certain of his claim on her heart. Publicly and permanently, before the whole watching world if that was what it took. He did not have to wait weeks. That very evening, at the small gathering held after the ceremony in the Whitfield home, with fiddles playing and neighbors dancing and the warm smell of wedding cake filling the rooms, Gideon found a quiet moment to draw Alma aside onto the porch, away from the noise and the crowd, beneath a sky gone thick with stars. "I've been patient," he said, "waiting to see if what I feel for you would hold steady once we weren't snowed in together with nothing else to occupy our minds but each other. And I find, Alma, that it's held steadier than I expected. I find I think of you every waking hour and dream of you the hours I'm not awake, and I don't want to spend one more day pretending that isn't so." Alma's breath caught, her eyes bright in the starlight. "Gideon," she said softly. He reached into the pocket of his good coat, the one he had bought new in Hartwell for the occasion of the wedding, and drew out a small object wrapped in a scrap of the same rough brown wool that had gone into the border of the quilt. For he had asked Alma, before she finished the border, for a piece of that particular fabric, without telling her why, and she had given it to him with a curious look he had not explained until this very moment. "I had this made in Hartwell," he said, unwrapping the fabric to reveal a simple gold band, plain but solid, The kind of ring a working man could afford and a sensible woman would treasure all the more for its lack of ostentation. It ain't much to look at, but neither am I, and I figured it suited. Gideon, Alma said again, her voice trembling now, tears standing bright in her eyes. Alma Reed, Gideon said, and he went down on one knee there on the porch, the fiddle music drifting out from the open door behind them, the stars wheeling overhead in that vast mountain sky. Will you marry me? Will you come live in my cabin up on Willow Creek and quilt by my fire and grow old with me in those mountains that near took your life the day I found you, but that I've come to think gave me the finest gift of my whole life in giving me you? Yes, Alma said, not a moment's hesitation in it, the word coming out on a breath of laughter and tears both at once. Yes, Gideon, of course, yes. He slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit as though it had been made for her alone, which in truth it had, Bertha Coyle having taken careful note of Alma's hand during a visit to the store weeks before, and passed the measurement along to the silversmith in Hartwell without either Alma or Gideon the wiser until this moment. And then Gideon rose and gathered Alma into his arms, this strong, capable woman who had survived a mountain storm and found, in the wreckage of her wagon and her plans, a life she had never thought to look for, and he kissed her there beneath the wedding stars while inside the fiddle music swelled, and Louisa, watching through the window with tears of her own joy streaming down her face, called for Thomas to come quick and see, and the whole party spilled out onto the porch to offer congratulations that lasted well past midnight. They were married themselves within the month, in the same small Silverton church, Louisa standing as witness for her sister, Thomas standing for Gideon, and Bertha Coyle traveling all the way from Hartwell with a wedding gift of good wool broadcloth. She claimed to have had lying about the store with no particular purpose, though everyone present understood it for the kindness it was. The ceremony was simple, as befit two people who had found each other not through courtship in a drawing room but through survival on a mountainside, and the vows they spoke to each other carried a weight that came from having already proven, in the crucible of that first terrible storm, exactly what kind of devotion each was capable of. They returned to the cabin on Willow Creek as husband and wife, and Alma brought with her not only her trunk of belongings but a determination to make the cabin as much her home as it had ever been Gideon's alone. And in the months that followed, she set about that task with the same steady, patient skill she brought to her quilting. She planted a small garden in the clearing behind the cabin, hung curtains at every window, and filled the shelves Gideon built for her with quilts of her own making, each one telling its own story in scraps of fabric gathered from the life they were building together. Winter came again, as it always did in those mountains, but this winter Gideon and Alma faced it together, the cabin warm with two hearts instead of one. And when the snow piled high against the walls and the wind screamed down off the peaks the way it had the day Gideon found her, Alma would sometimes look up from her quilting by the fire and catch Gideon watching her with an expression of such open tenderness that it still, even months into their marriage, made her breath catch. "What is it?" she asked him once on such an evening, the fire crackling low, snow ticking softly against the window pane. "Just thinking," Gideon said, "how close I came to riding past that gully without stopping. How the wind was loud enough that day I nearly convinced myself I'd imagined the sound of it, if I'd ridden on just a half-mile further before turning back. But you didn't," Alma said gently, setting down her needle and crossing to sit beside him, taking his large, calloused hand in both of hers. "You stopped. You listened. That's the whole of it, Gideon. You listened when it mattered." "I thank God every day that I did," Gideon said, and he pulled her close against his chest, this woman who had come into his quiet life like a spark catching dry kindling. And he thought, as he often did in such moments, that he had spent 9 years thinking himself content with solitude, never understanding what he had been missing until the mountain itself, in its cruelty, had handed him the one thing that made all those solitary years finally make sense. Spring came, as it always eventually did even to that high country, the snow retreating up the peaks, the creek running fast and loud with melt, wildflowers pushing up through the thawing ground in the clearing where Alma had planted her garden the autumn before. And it was in that spring, nearly a year after the storm that had first brought them together, that Alma told Gideon, on a morning bright with new sun, that she was carrying his child. Gideon, who had faced down mountain lions and winter storms in the long, hard solitude of 9 years without complaint, found himself entirely undone by this news, sitting down heavily on the porch step and staring at Alma with an expression of such stunned joy that she laughed aloud at the sight of him. "A child," he said, as though testing the word for weight. "Ours." "Ours," Alma confirmed, sitting beside him and taking his hand, resting it against the still flat curve of her stomach. "Come winter, I expect, or perhaps just after. The timing seems fitting, don't you think, given how we began?" "Fitting," Gideon agreed, his voice thick, and he turned his hand beneath hers so that their fingers laced together, and they sat like that for a long while on the porch step, watching the creek run bright with snowmelt below them, saying nothing more because nothing more needed saying. The child, a son, was born in the depths of the following winter, during a storm that Alma would later say reminded her powerfully of the one that had first brought his parents together, though this storm passed without incident, the cabin warm and well-stocked, a midwife from Hartwell having arrived 2 days before the birth in anticipation of the coming snow, an old woman named Sarah Duncan who had delivered half the babies in that county, and pronounced both mother and child hale and strong. They named him Elias, after Gideon's father, and he grew up in that cabin on Willow Creek with his mother's dark eyes and his father's broad shoulders even as an infant. And 2 years after his birth, a daughter followed, whom they named Margaret after Alma's own mother, and the small cabin that had once housed a solitary trapper now rang with the sounds of children's laughter and the steady, contented business of a family growing into itself. Louisa and Thomas Whitfield remained in Silverton, where Thomas's assaying work prospered alongside the growing mining town, and the sisters visited each other as often as the mountain roads allowed, Louisa bringing her own children, born in steady succession over the following years, to play alongside their cousins Elias and Margaret in the clearing behind Gideon and Alma's cabin. The two sisters sitting together on the porch quilting, while their husbands talked of horses and mining claims and the ever-changing fortunes of the territory. And it was on one such visit, some 6 years after that first terrible storm, that Louisa remarked to her sister how strange it was to think back on that. Near tragedy and see, instead of grief, the whole of the happy life it had somehow set in motion. "I think of it often," Alma admitted, watching her children play in the grass, Elias already showing signs of his father's steady patience, Margaret possessed of a fierce independence that reminded Alma powerfully of herself at that age. "How close I came to dying under that wagon. How if Gideon hadn't heard me, hadn't stopped to listen. But he did," Louisa said, echoing without knowing it the very words Alma had once offered Gideon on a snowy evening years before. "He did stop, and he did listen, and here you are." "Here I am," Alma agreed, and she looked toward the cabin, where Gideon stood in the doorway watching his children play, his face soft with a contentment that had settled into him so thoroughly over the years that it seemed now simply a permanent feature of the man, as much a part of him as his broad shoulders or his gentle hands. And Alma thought, as she often did in quiet moments, that she had come into these mountains carrying an unfinished quilt meant for someone else's wedding, and had found instead, in the wreckage of her wagon and the mercy of a passing storm, the beginning of an entirely different life, one she had not planned for but would not, given every chance to choose again, have chosen any differently. The quilt that had saved her life, the one Gideon's mother had made and sent from Missouri, still hung on the wall of their cabin bedroom, too precious now to use for its original purpose, though its warmth had long since been surpassed by the many quilts Alma herself had made in the years since, each one telling its own story in scraps of fabric. a piece of Elia's first blanket, a scrap from the dress Margaret wore to her cousin's wedding, a fragment of the shirt Gideon had worn the day he taught his son to fish in Willow Creek. The unfinished quilt, the one meant for Louis's wedding, hung now in the Whitfield home in Silverton, complete and beautiful, its border of rough brown wool a permanent reminder, for anyone who knew the story, of exactly where and how its maker had found the rest of her life waiting for her. Gideon Monroe, who had once believed himself content to live out his years alone in the high country with only his horse and his traps and the vast, indifferent mountains for company, found himself instead, as the years passed, at the center of a family that grew steadily around him. A third child, another son they named Jacob, born when Elias was 5 and Margaret was 3, and later still a fourth, a daughter named Ruth, born the same autumn that Elias, grown into a sturdy boy of 11, rode with his father for the first time to check the trap lines that had once been Gideon's sole occupation, and were now a family tradition passed from father to son. The cabin on Willow Creek expanded over those years too, Gideon adding a second bedroom and then a third as the children grew too old to share the loft comfortably, and the porch that had once been simple and unadorned now held, most evenings, the whole family gathered together, Alma quilting, Gideon mending harness or whittling toys for the younger children, the older ones doing lessons by lamplight that Alma taught them herself. Having insisted from the earliest days that her children would read and write, and know their letters as well as any child raised in a proper schoolhouse in Denver or Silverton. And on winter evenings, when the storms came down off the peaks the way they always had and always would in that high country, and the wind screamed against the cabin walls with a voice that Alma still sometimes thought sounded like a woman crying, Gideon would build the fire high and gather his family clothes, and Alma would tell the children the story of how their parents had met, of the wagon wreck and the unfinished quilt, and the mountain man who had heard a cry in the storm and stopped to listen when a lesser man might have ridden on, and the children never tired of hearing it, Elias and Margaret and Jacob and little Ruth, all leaning close to the fire while their mother spoke, and their father sat with an arm around her shoulders, his eyes on her face with the same tender attention he had shown her from that very first night, 9 years, and then 12 years, and then 20 years into a marriage that had begun in the worst storm either of them had ever survived, and had grown, season by season, into the finest and most enduring happiness either of them had ever known or thought possible. And that, Alma would say at the end of the telling every single time, is how a mountain man found a stranded quilter shivering under her own unfinished work, and wrapped her in a finished one, and gave her, without either of us quite realizing it at the time, the whole rest of her life. The best decision I ever made, Gideon would add every time, was stopping to listen that day, instead of riding on. The best decision you ever made, Alma would correct him, smiling, was everything you did after that. Anyone might have stopped for a stranger in trouble. Not every man would have stayed, season after season, and built a whole life around the woman he found. And Gideon, looking at his wife across the firelight, their children gathered close, the quilt she had made hanging warm on every bed in the cabin they had built together, thread by thread and year by year, would simply nod because there was nothing more true to say, and no need to say more than the truth, not when the truth itself, plain and solid as the mountains around them, was this: that a storm had brought them together, but it was love, patient and steady as the seasons, that had kept them, and would keep them for all the years still left to come.